Good evening, everybody. How are y'all doing? Thanks for tuning in. Good evening, distinguished guests, President Alger, Dr. Tim Miller, Dr. Malika Carter-Hoyt, Dr. Kirkpatrick, James Madison University administrators, staff, faculty, students, family, and friends, and Harrisonburg and Rockingham County community members. And a special good evening to our exceptional keynote speaker, Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil. It's a pleasure to have you all tune in this evening. My name is Layla Andress, and it's my pleasure to be your MC. I am a third-year junior from Richmond, Virginia, and a soon-to-be Centennial Scholars Program graduate with a hospitality management degree and a minor in business. I hope to one day influence and help the Black community by helping youth in low-income areas learn about the endless resources and opportunities available to them through leadership and guidance, of course with hospitality in mind. Martin Luther King perpetuated self-reflection and change that influenced the Civil Rights Act. This opportunity afforded growth, equality, and trust within the Black community. His I Have a Dream speech, to me, changed countless lives, not only for his time, but for all subsequent decades. His movement paved the way for progress, inspiring generations to believe in the power of their dreams and the power to believe in the possibility of a more inclusive future. I myself, standing on the stage, am a product of the tireless efforts of all those involved in the civil rights movement. And with that in mind, this day marks the annual celebration for the national holiday honoring the life and accomplishments of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we are honored to shed the light on his legacy by keeping his memory alive. Dr. King was a driving force during the civil rights era and critically influenced figure in advocating for justice and equity through nonviolent acts. His courage, perseverance, and grit continue to inspire, motivate, and empower young advocates like myself to engage in acts of social justice and spread the light on some of those voices who have been ignored and disregarded. On behalf of the Center for Multicultural Student Services, also known as CMIS, we would like to welcome you to our 37th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Keynote Program. As a community, we are deeply honored to make time to reflect on our history around civil rights and contemplate our current issue and uplift and inspire each other. This year's theme for MLK Week is, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that mattered," a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King. Distinguished guests, we are tied together, and throughout history, we have witnessed nations that have undergone revolutions of reform, with others remaining dormant in the midst of great change. But Reverend Dr. King encourages us to remain awake through the Great Revolution. Although we have made great strides toward justice, we must continue to work together because whatever affects you affects me too. As our new generation, we continue to stand on their shoulders by implementing change and uplifting our communities. Through Dr. King's blueprint, we will remain awake. We will remain awake with the revolution of change. This evening, we invite you to reflect on the quote and consider the ways in which Dr. King's message and values manifests in our modern quest for equity. Imagine a community that exudes liberation, peace, courage, and allyship to all individuals. At this time, we would like to introduce President Jonathan Alger. Mr. Jonathan Alger is our 6th president of James Madison University, serving in his role since 2012. He has previously served as Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Rutgers University, Assistant General Counsel at the University of Michigan, and in legal policy positions at the American Association of University Professors and the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, also known as OCR, where he developed national policies on civil rights issues. In all of these roles, Mr. Alger has taken leading roles in shaping policies and structures for building inclusive academic communities. He is a graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School. Please welcome President Alger to the stage.
Thank you so much, Layla, and good evening, everyone. I'm so grateful that and I hope that you are all safe and warm as we celebrate the life, lessons, and legacy of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. tonight. I also want to take a moment to thank the team for all of the investment, planning, and hard work that made this week and this event possible. So a very, very special thanks to Valerie Gant, Rebecca Barge, and many others. As you all know, Dr. King made a tremendous impact in his short life as he worked to usher in a new era of civil rights progress in our nation. As we stand here, over 50 years later, we're aware of the important and hard work ahead of us, and while also being lifted up by Dr. King's own words of hope. Dr. King had a unique ability to highlight our immense challenges while fiercely focusing on hope. During King's time, as it is true today, there was widespread distrust in institutions and in government leaders, increasing in the United States with Vietnam War protests from 1965 forward. In the midst of this tumultuous and changing context, Dr. King wrote an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "The Time for Freedom Has Come." In this op-ed, King credits college students with being the engine for change and for their prophetic calls for justice. Focusing on these students, King called a reeling nation back to the promise of the founding. These students are not struggling for themselves alone. They are seeking to save the soul of America. They are taking our whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. In that same piece, King was honest about the shortcomings of our democracy, which were clearly apparent to him. But King nonetheless held out hope in the promise of American democracy, hope in the promise of all of us working together. He concluded, "Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy." And so we pick up King's mantle, led by the hopes and voices of our own students who are among us today. Dr. King knew that if we are to create a better world for future generations and for ourselves, we have to believe in what he called an audacious faith in the future. For us, that future is inextricably connected to our students and their lifelong impact as engaged citizens. Even in the most challenging times in our country, we must believe that our best days are ahead of us. Alongside Dr. King, I'm convinced that democracy is not a spectator sport. We, the people, must strive to create that more perfect union. These words translate into a direct call to action for every generation. We are indeed in this together. I know that if we're willing to have faith, as Dr. King suggests, and to follow it up with a commitment to action, then we can realize the true promise of the community we know we can be, here at James Madison University and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, President Alger, for that warm and heartfelt welcome. I will now introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil. Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil is a passionate, powerful, and prophetic woman. She is a woman of God who is gifted as a teacher and preacher, and is a leader in the international movement for peace and reconciliation. Her mission is to inspire, equip, and empower emerging Christian leaders to be practitioners of reconciliation in their various spheres of influence. She is an associate professor of reconciliation studies in the School of Theology at Seattle Pacific University, where she also directs the Reconciliation Studies program. She also serves on the pastoral staff of Quest Church in Seattle, Washington. Dr. Brenda is recognized internationally as one of the foremost leaders of reconciliation and was featured as one of the 50 most influential women to watch by Christianity Today. She is the author of Roadmap to Reconciliation 2.0, A Credible Witness, Reflections on Power, Evangelism, and Race, The Heart of Racial Justice, How Soul Change Leads to Social Justice, and co-authored with Rick Richardson in her newest book, Becoming Brave, Finding the Courage to Pursue Racial Justice Now. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil to the stage.
It is indeed my honor to be with you for this very, very, very special and important occasion. Given the world that we live in, it is very much a significant time for us to remember the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. For this 2024 JMU MLK Keynote program, I am grateful for everything that has gone into having me here with you. I'm deeply honored and grateful, thankful. The people that I've met here, Valerie Gant, and all of you who have made this possible have put a lot of work into it and thought into it, which speaks a lot to the intentionality of JMU. And so it's with that that I'm excited to be able to share what's been on my heart now for some time. I've thought a lot about what it means to honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. I've thought a lot about what it means to be doers and not just dreamers. And so the message that has been on my heart will sound a bit odd, especially in an academic institution, but I'd like to speak about street sweepers for justice. Feel like preaching already. Street sweepers for justice. You see, when I was a little girl, my parents had albums, LPs, and my dad would play these albums of Dr. Martin Luther King's sermons. And so as we would listen to these sermons, often on a Saturday morning, they would occasionally kind of stop and we'd talk about them as a family. The sermon that really stuck out for me was called The Street Sweeper. In this message, Dr. King said this: when you discover what you will be in your life, set out to do it as if God Almighty called you at this particular moment in history to do it. Don't just set out to do a good job. Set out to do such a good job that the living, the dead, and the unborn couldn't do it any better. If it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, sweep streets like Michelangelo painted pictures. Sweep streets like Beethoven composed music. Sweep streets like Leontine Price sings before the Metropolitan Opera. Sweep streets like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who swept his or her job well. Now that'll preach. And it's instructive to us, especially those of us in academic situations and environments. You see, it's important to note that Dr. King gave this message to students at Barrett Junior High School in Philadelphia on October of 1967. And when I stumbled on the origins of this particular message that he gave and the audience that he was speaking to, it grabbed my attention. Why call students to this vision of being street sweepers? I think perhaps he was trying to help young people then and now to understand the importance of the educations that we receive, to understand what it really means to be successful. We can be trapped into thinking that our degrees is what makes us special, that being smart and intellectual makes us special. We can get trapped into the rat race of believing that acquiring more stuff is what makes us successful. And so Dr. King took an analogy from the street level of life and called us to reevaluate how we measure success. These students were living in what was known as the long, hot summer of 1967. This was a time when injustice stemming from the frustrations of poverty and unemployment, the systematic denial of employment opportunities by white-owned businesses and city services, by white-led municipal governments, and mistreatment by mostly white police forces led to explosive confrontations between black residents and the forces that oppressed them. Sound familiar? Unfortunately, it does to me. In many ways, they were living in an extremely divisive time, similar to the one that we're living in right now. So this gathering annually for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is not just perfunctory, it's necessary. We must remind ourselves of the time in which we live and what it calls for from each and every one of us. He was calling those students, I believe, and us to use our education to make the world better by actively being street sweepers for justice. To be proximate enough to the pain that we would be moved to do something about it. This reminds me of a story in the Bible. That story is about a well-educated lawyer who learns a life-saving lesson about the urgent need for people to be street sweepers for justice. If you'll allow me, this is what the text says. There was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road, but when he saw the man, he angled across to the other side. Then a Levite, religious man, showed up. He also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan traveling the road came to him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him on his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of him. If it cost any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." What do you think? Which of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers? The one who treated him kindly. The religion scholar responded, and Jesus said, "Go and do the same." You see, this speaks very profoundly to me at this point in time. It might be important for us to interrogate this story and take it beyond what seems to be a parable that perhaps is just nice about being neighborly to each other. Note that Jesus has been identified as an exceptional teacher. His reputation has grown, and people are impressed with the wisdom and insightfulness of what he speaks of. But this well-educated lawyer has decided that he's going to put Jesus to the test. He's going to decide, are you really as smart as all the people seem to suggest that you are? And so he comes up with what seems to be a pretty simple question. What must I do to inherit eternal life, since you're so smart, Jesus? In essence, he wanted to know how he could live his life full of meaning and purpose, how he could live in such a way that he could be sure that on the day of judgment it would be well between him and God. Jesus may have sensed the draw into an intellectual debate, so he chose to answer the lawyer's question with a question. And he says to him, "What's written in the law? What do you read there?" The lawyer quickly and confidently gives the right answer. "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus affirms that he has given the right answer and calls him to put that into action. Go do it. But the lawyer tries to continue the debate by asking the question, "So who is my neighbor?" First, it's important to notice that as Jesus answers this question, the story takes place on a road that most Jews would never, ever have been on if they weren't trying to avoid Samaria. It's hard to even say it because I know of communities that people avoid going into just not to be with those people. You no doubt can think of places where people refuse to go and will take the long way around the freeway through to avoid those people. They don't go to those countries. They don't eat in those places. They don't want to be around those folks. And whoever those people are for you, wherever you find yourself in your social location, Jesus places this story on a road where as soon as a Jewish ear heard it, would wonder, why was the Samaritan helpful to a person who was trying to avoid him? That sets us up for the lesson to be learned here. You see, this man who has been beaten half dead got into this situation because he's trying his best not to be around Samaritans. Samaritans were considered half-breed dogs. They were considered unclean people, and Jews did not associate with Samaritans. I think that this story is trying to pull us into the divisiveness that causes people to stay on one side of the fence or the tracks, or in one community and not another. The impressions that we have of each other because we've not had a close enough proximity to one another to know the truth of each other's stories. Jesus, I think, is helping us to interrogate social locations. It suggests that we don't know how other persons live, and we therefore don't know the situations that they find themselves in. And there are no explanations given. Did you notice as I read? There's nothing that says why this man is traveling on this road. All it says is that that's where he finds himself. All we know is that the decision to avoid going through Samaria has put this man on a very dangerous road, and he has been beat up and left half dead. That's all we need to know. Someone is in a desperate situation and needs help. Secondly, I note that in this story, there are different ways to respond to the messiness of people whose lives we see laying on the ground. There are several people in this story who could have responded. We see, first of all, the lawyer. The lawyer wants to turn people's plight into an intellectual debate. What do you think about such and such a situation? What do you think about such and such a law? Who do you think we should vote for about this? And what do you think we should do about this? And why do you think da-da-da-da? And whatever the issue is, be it immigration, be it homelessness, be it health care, we find ourselves debating it like the lawyer because we're smart. So let's talk about it, Jesus. Whatever the situation is, like the lawyer, there could be an intentional or unintentional kind of joust that goes on in intellectual circles where we debate things but never address those things. We can talk about materialism and economic exploitation but not necessarily do something about it. We can talk about political divisiveness and misinformation or disinformation and talk about it, but not necessarily do something about it? Could it be that we can understand that we are living in a time of environmental injustice and say, woe is me, but not necessarily know how we go address the situation? It could be that the pipeline from public school to prison is a dilemma that we know about, but don't know what to do about. So we talk about it. And we debate about it, and we intellectualize about it. I'm concerned about gun violence and militarism and its increase. My heart is absolutely broken about the number of shootings that are happening all over our country and the wars that rage around the world. And sometimes as I watch the news trying to stay informed about it, I get tired of watching people talk about it, even in this political cycle that we're in right now. And I wonder who's going to do something about it. The lawyer represents that, I think, in this story. Unfortunately, we're living in a time when many people are using their theology to justify decisions of crossing the street. And that's where the other two people in the story enter in. We have religious folks in the story who see the dilemma, who see the plight, who know the man has been left half dead, and there is no explanation as to why they don't help. But wouldn't you think that if I was there, Reverend Dr. Brenda might try to help? And it's trying to say that religious people are not exempt from this critique too. That we too have to examine our responses, or lack thereof, to the plight of the people we see around us. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. constantly spoke in religious circles and constantly called people of faith to do more, to be more actively involved on the front lines of injustice. But here in our story, we see that the Levite and the priest, and they say, don't say why, both of them crossed the street. Unfortunately, that is one of the signs of having a theology that doesn't have a practical relationship to the hurt and harm that is happening around us. It feels more like a belief system and less than, and not necessarily a cure to the crisis. And then here comes the unlikely hero, the Samaritan. A Samaritan who's on that road because that's the road that Samaritans would travel back and forth. But Jews are not supposed to be on that road. And as we read the story and interrogate it, the one person who rightly responds to the question, who is my neighbor, is the least likely person to do so. It says in our story, in the text, that the Samaritan man was moved by compassion. Now, compassion is not just some warm and fuzzy feeling. Compassion is gut-wrenching. Compassion causes you to double over with agony when you see the pictures of the starving, or when you see or hear another mass shooting. It's the thing that doubles you over and you can't not feel something about it. That's how the Samaritan feels. He is now moved with compassion, which motivates him, yea, compels him to get actually involved, to get close enough to the pain, get close enough to the person, to touch them and to do something, anything to try to be of help. I cannot walk by and pretend that I don't see what I see. And so he identifies with the man on the road. The Samaritan knows what it feels like to be discriminated against. The Samaritan knows what it feels like not to have social justice, to be a person who is on the outside and not on the inside. And so he identifies with a person who gets passed by. He saw this other human being as a human being. And he said, I think if that were me laying on the ground, if I were the person who didn't have health care, if I was the person working for minimum wage and still can't pay my bills, if I was the person with limited accessibility, if I were the person who was an immigrant seeking safety, if I was the person, and you fill in the blank, I would hope that someone would stop and help me. That's how compassion feels. Compassion says, if that was me, I would wish that they would do for me what I will now do for them. So, on this day that we honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., my prayer is that we will honor the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King by actively being street sweepers for justice in a world that so desperately needs to see us actively involved. I don't want to speak just to speak. I don't want to teach just to teach. I don't want you to learn just to learn. We're supposed to accumulate all of this for the common good, for the betterment of the world around us. It is not just to make us special. It is not just to make us rich. It is for the common good. And so with that in mind, my prayer is that we will commit ourselves to the messy work of getting close enough to the plight of people to have compassion for those who have been kicked to the curb and left half dead. Let's not debate it. Let's not believe that we don't see it or make believe that we don't see it. Let's not question it. Let's not, for God's sake, keep silent about it. Let's take the courageous risk to speak up, stand up, say something. We must let our lives speak, which is why this quote matters so much. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. That is not just a cliche. It's a call to action. So may God give us courage to get involved in the messy work of loving our neighbors, knowing that as we do, it will transform our lives and the world. I am grateful for this charge and pray that we'll take it seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Salter McNeil, for your insightful keynote address. That was incredible. Thank you. Can we please make sure we give her another round of applause from home? We hope you have enjoyed your annual formal programming honoring Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and I encourage everyone in the audience to reflect on how this program has made you feel. This has been an honor being your hostess for the evening. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Valerie Gant, Director of the Center for Multicultural Student Services, to provide us with the closing remarks.
Good evening, everyone. As what's been said earlier, so glad that you're home safe and sound and you're able to join in with us tonight as we celebrate the legacy and the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What a phenomenal evening it has been. I just have a few notes of thank you to our leadership, President Alger, for always supporting us on this holiday, always being here for each program. I'd also like to thank the leadership, the senior leadership, Dr. Miller, who's the Vice President for Student Affairs. And I'd also like to thank our Madison Vision Series for partnering with us on our MLK program, and Dr. David Kilpatrick. Thank you so much for being here online. It's a different platform for me. You know, usually you're here to give me that energy, and we have a laugh or two. But Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil, thank you for that amazing message. It's right here in the heart. She is kind, she is warm, and she exudes the passion and the compassion that she spoke about. So we'd like for you to use the QR code and give us your feedback. We'd like to stay in touch with you as well. So give us your contact information, and we'll be sure to invite you to some of our upcoming events. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.